For those of you all joining in now, welcome to our Anne Lindberg's first webinar on this new format that we're doing. She just created a stunning new body of work called titled Vivid Messengers. And today she is joined with Candice Madey to have a wonderful discussion. So part of the thing that I've been trying to do during this incredibly different time is offer something much more of an experience than just coming to a gallery, seeing new art, maybe even acquiring something and taking it home. I'm trying to give all of the rest of the world the wonderful thing that I get by seeing everything kind of behind the scenes, and also having really interesting dialogues with my artists and with curators and with so forth. I mean, it's, if you think about it, if you were back in Picasso's time and you didn't just, you know, get a painting, but you got to hang out with him and, you know, hear more what he's thinking about and looking at and so forth. So to me, this makes a much more kind of very rich feeling, an experience, experiencing art, looking at art, talking about art. So I'm very excited to listen in and hear what we are moving through with these two wonderful ladies. Take it away.
Well, I thought I would introduce Candice, since I know her, and Carrie and the crew at the gallery are just getting to meet her through Zoom in the last few weeks. So I'm really delighted to introduce you to Candice Madey, who I've known for a few years now. I met her shortly after I moved to the Hudson Valley. She is the owner of Stellar Projects, which is an art consulting firm that specializes in strategic planning and cultural programming for institutions and private foundations. She's also the curator of the River Valley Arts Collective, which is a not-for-profit Hudson Valley-based organization for the visual arts that will have ongoing programming and is probably going to have bricks and mortar sometime soon. Post-COVID, perhaps. It's been a bit slowed by that. Before turning her organization into Stellar Projects, she opened and pioneered an incredible, prominent Lower East Side gallery called On Stellar Rays that she ran for a number of years, and she's recently moved to the Catskills in the Hudson Valley. So it's my pleasure to have worked with her on a couple exhibitions, and I think we're going to cover those. And I've found our dialogue to be really fruitful. So here we are. I want to thank Carrie and Kelly and Britton and Nate from the gallery, and of course to thank Candice. So I'll let you get us started, my dear.
Great. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Carrie, and everyone from the gallery for helping facilitate this. It's been really a pleasure to have a dialogue with Anne the last couple of years. I think it's been particularly intense the last few weeks because we actually had an exhibition that we worked on together. So I think I feel like that conversation intensified a bit in the last few weeks. So this feels like a really kind of opportune time to share some of the things that we've been discussing with a larger audience. So I hope it's generative. And we're going to look at some images, and then we are going to discuss the images. We'll talk a little bit without images, kind of more generally. And then we're going to have a Q&A. So I encourage everyone to participate in that part, and hopefully some of the dialogue that Anne and I have been having can continue and be generative in that part of the event. So at this moment, I am going to pull up some images. Okay, how does that look?
Looks great.
Okay, good. So this is a picture of Anne in the studio that some people may have seen. We've used it for some events and promotion. And I guess I would start here because I first visited Anne's studio a little over 2 years ago, and spent nice afternoon at her studio, and we had lunch together. She prepared lunch for a small group of people. And I was very quickly drawn to her bookshelves. So I knew quickly that there were definitely some overlapping interests. And I think that day we shared some books on trees and walking were the topics that came up that day. Either we were both reading The Secret Life of Trees, or we definitely discussed it. And then there were a couple books on walking that we shared, and I got a great recommendation from Anne that day. So we'll come back to that a little later, but I just wanted to start with that. And so quickly after that, I was involved in a group exhibition called Still Life in Hudson. So you can see here that Anne's drawing was included in that show, this stunning drawing called It Steals Upon You When It Steals Upon You. And it's about 100 inches long. And I thought that this might be a good place to start because this was the first work that I really spent time with and got to know well as I was spending time in the gallery. And as you can see, it's quite different from the work that's in the current exhibition at Carrie's. And so I thought we would start there. I think, notably the palette is very different. I think also there's sort of a different sense of movement between these two works. And so I just thought, Anne, it would be really great to hear from you about what changed. I think we all know, working in the last few months during COVID has been a big shift. And I know this work is from 2020, so this was made in that period. But I'm wondering if you could speak to the colors and sort of the kind of the urgency and the yellows and reds and oranges that are present in the new pieces, and also speak to a bit of this sort of sense of movement or time that's shifted so much.
Yeah, maybe we could just take just a minute with the prior image to sort of contextualize something that seems worth remarking upon. So this drawing I made not long after I moved from Kansas City to the Hudson Valley. So in a quite literal way, I've used the river as a as a measuring point. So I grew up along the Iowa River. I was living in Kansas City along the Missouri and nearby the Kansas River, or the Kaw as it's called, and now the Hudson River. And one of the first things that became really clear to me when I moved here was the quality of amber light. And the Hudson River School painters certainly expressed that sort of constant quality of the warmth of light. So this was part of a body of work I made in the first couple of years living here, where I worked with copper and gold and sort of infused the drawings with a kind of amber warmth. So if we go to the next image, what I want to say to one of the current drawings, what I want to say is that the bodies of work that flow from the studio, it's a long conversation I'm having with ideas and imagery and mark making processes and formats and so on. The influences can range from environmental to more emotional or psychological, and certainly then obviously the formal. But I would say that prior body of work was extremely influenced by the change in the landscape I was living within. And I live in a rural area, so the sky dome is ever present. And the breaks from my studio usually involve stepping out and spending time with the sky. But the work made during the COVID, and all of this work we're going to look at has been made since like the 11th of March or whatever, when I returned from a weekend in New York where the city was beginning to empty out. And a few short days later, the governor locked down New York City, and all of us began to be in shelter in place. So what felt right, I made this work sort of instinctively, quite quickly. I would say most of this work was made in the second half of March and was sort of finished and clarified in April, a little bit into May. It was a kind of urgency about the color. It seemed to make sense to sort of express the rage I felt, the despair, the sense of uncertainty. And I think I've realized that color has the power to speak to emotions. I mean, we all know that it has symbolic value, but if you really let it happen, I mean, I'm separating the colors in different ways and blending them in new ways. So along the line, the color changes as opposed to within its pacing as the drawing is made. So there's a knitting where I was trying to get the drawings to feel like they'd gone through some change, or they have experienced a disruption or an unannounced presence of some kind, which is what I felt quite intensely. So yeah, very, very much tied to my psychological state, which was and is quite disparate.
Yeah, the energy is a bit more erratic, you know, you have that sense. And the titles of these are related. I think they all include the word flash. This is flash. Oh, I'm skipping ahead. So these are all three from that series, correct? These are all 2020.
Yeah, all the drawings made for that are part of the show. I didn't make them for the show, but they became a show. Begin with the word flash, and then they express something about the nature of that flash. This one's called Flash Opposites. The prior one, yeah, so the word, it took a long time to sort of figure out the right word to express this idea of a sudden sort of unannounced presence. Mm-hmm. I mean, the word flash is certainly hot flash, but news flash, you know, that which flash of light, flash of color, flush of color. And flash also implies speed to me, where it's a flash is sudden, then the flash on a camera that changes the condition of light. So all of those kind of references of that word seem to embody sort of what I was after. The one with the pink form in it is called Flash Hot. Yeah.
These also have the sense of, you know, when you're on a train and things are moving by and you don't really have a sense of location, and it's really the sense I get, which is quite different. I'm going to move ahead to include the other drawings that are in this show that are a bit different, that were done before March of 2020, I believe late fall 2019. Yeah. So in this photo of the studio, we're looking at the most recent flash drawings alongside these works along the bottom that have your signature, you know, colored pencil line work with these shadows. And I just found it so interesting that the title of this series is Something Clear, which is very different than Flash, which is kind of sudden and hot and muddled, and Something Clear, you know, the idea of clarity feels like a long time ago, or something that I haven't felt for a while. So I wonder, you know, I almost feel a bit nostalgic about it. I mean, everything has changed so much, and sort of locating oneself in that, in the world we're in right now, is so difficult. So I wonder what, you know, where your head was when you were making these pieces, and if you have a similar, if the title of the series has changed for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely, it's changed. I mean, the titling of that body of work, I made quite a number of them. These are 4. There are 4 that were shown in that image and 4 in the show. Yeah, I made them in the second half of 2019 and finished these that we're looking at toward the end of 19. Yeah, Something Clear, like who knew it would all become so unclear and uncertain and uneasy with edges not pronounced. Yeah, this work evolved from kind of some observations of the work while I'm working on it. So the drawings get moved around in the studio a lot. They're vertical, they're horizontal, they get flipped around in order to manage kind of the delicacy of them, particularly when they're large. These are not large.
Mm-hmm.
They go over to be sprayed. They get shifted around a lot. And in that process, the light condition in my studio is such that sometimes they've been on a table and there's been a dramatic shadow cast across the work. And given the sort of state of mind that I work in, I can't help but see that. And so I thought, well, I could make work that tried to translate this idea. Normally the forms in the work are quite ambiguous and they feel like they're buried way back in the drawing. Like the sense of darkness is way back in there. You can't tell if it's anything other than darkness or a sense of something. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to try like what happens if it's quite distinct and is predetermined before I draw it and so on. So that's what evolved. And I named them something clear long before we arrived into the situation we're in now. So yeah, the balance of that body of work to this, I think, tells the story of, you go along and then something changes. Yeah, and sort of that word clear, it's hard to even say that now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
well, it's interesting in these as well that, although they're titled something clear, they still, the idea of them having shadows it's hard not to read this as a sort of premonition or something. I mean, we're in difficult times even before COVID, so, it's not so surprising, but it is this idea of the obscuring or the shadow I find really interesting. This one, I wanted to ask you something I haven't asked you about the title, because it comes back to, I'm going to circle back to when we first met. And I think we talked about Rebecca Solnit's book, Wanderlust. Mm-hmm. And you recommended The Philosophy of Walking, another book about walking by Frederick Gross, which I then promptly went out and bought and read. And so I have my thought on this title in the context of our conversations and these books that we've read on walking. But I'm curious for you, the Frederick Gross book, I think is, has chapters like Melancholy Wandering or Urban Flaneur or The Walker's Waking Dreams. It's very poetic. Whereas the Rebecca Solnit book is much more about culture and politics and, a history of walking going back to the Athenians. So I'm wondering about this title, Woman Walking, and which of those two this might fall into, or where that came from.
Yeah, I think this is the Solnit in me, if there is any. Yeah, that's a really incredible book. It's basically a history of walking in culture, the ways in which walking's been used to communicate ideas, to generate ideas. Wordsworth walked to develop his poetry. Many philosophers walked to, theorize their ideas. Virginia Woolf wrote about walking. Many of her books include the tale of walking, and of course that's a more urban kind of idea, but yeah, I think when the shadow idea or these distinctive shapes found their presence in the work, it was in the midst of 2019, which was Me Too, all of these issues that we take in and participate in. And so this symbol is the symbol of the woman. And so the shadow became the woman and the shape became a symbol of the female. So yeah, it's called Flash Woman Walking. It's Yeah, it's the SoulNet it's the SoulNet book.
I thought it might be. I thought it might be. I know there's, and I haven't revisited that book actually since I read that when it came out I was in undergrad, so it's out for a very long time. But the chapter on women walking is a really powerful one, I think, and that, we take it for granted that we can wander and get lost unaccompanied, and that has not always been the case. So it's actually, when I saw the title of this, I kind of went back to our first meeting. Thank you, Anne, that's great. We're gonna touch very briefly on your use of your work with other materials. This show is based on the colored pencil drawings, but I just wanted to touch on these briefly because I think one thing that's very interesting is the way that a lot of these ideas kind of move between bodies of work pretty seamlessly. And so this is a piece, an installation made from thread in Raleigh a couple years ago, A Long Sun, is that the right title?
Yeah.
And so I just wonder if you have anything to share about this work and its relationship to the drawings. I know it seems that the kind of color is something that persists between these bodies of work.
Yeah, I have something to share and to read, but maybe before doing that, I just want to say for those who might not know the work real well, this reference to walking is quite literally related to the making of the work. So the drawing board behind me and the drawing board image that was first shown in this sequence of images shows that while I'm working, I'm pulling lines that are upwards of 10 feet. So the drawing board behind me enables me to make work that's beyond the span of my arms. So I'm taking steps as I'm walking, and given the repetitive nature of their production, I'm literally walking quite a bit. And also in the making of this body of work, the thread is moved back and forth between surfaces of the architecture, and in that sense is built into the architecture, and the thread needs to be walked. So this idea of pulling a long line from here to there, or taking steps from here to there, is part of all of the work. But yeah, this piece was made and sited in the space of the Contemporary Art Museum in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's called The Long Sun, and you can see that you can step under it. So the camera is back against a wall, and I think the space that you could get underneath was upwards of about 18 feet. So you dipped under it and could walk under it. It rose a bit into the corner so that the space under it got a little larger. But we can talk more about this, but I wanted to read something that maybe some of you would have heard me read before. It's from a really incredible book called I Send You This Cadmium Red. It's an illustrated book it's a book of letters that are illustrated, reproduced between John Berger, the critic and writer who died recently, one of my favorite thinkers of all time, and the filmmaker John Christie. And they discussed each color of the rainbow, and this particular piece of writing is about yellow. So bear with me while I read this short excerpt with you. I think this is Berger writing to Christie. Is honey the living equivalent of gold? Supposing one tried to give temperatures to colors. In a sense, we do it all the time when talking about warm and cool tones. A certain red is 98 degrees Celsius. Ultramarine is 7 degrees. Cobalt blue is -10. Maybe yellow is the one color which is body temperature, 37 degrees Celsius. And so the ancient Egyptians believed it was the color of immortality. You are struck by the fact that yellow is never regular. It's varied. As you say, it stores and reflects light, but it receives and gives off waves which are not constant, as though its surface is liquid rather than solid. And this irregularity reminds us of living skin, of a body.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's been a sort of a touchstone piece of writing for so long because it really gets at the idea that these thread installations really greet you from your body first.
Mm-hmm.
Quite physiological, optical. Like you meet them and greet them without language in your head, without
Mm-hmm.
intellectual discourse and analysis. It's more like, you know, they greet you from your gut.
Yeah.
And then come the more analytical, like, what is that? How is that made? You know, am I close to it? Am I far from it? Those kinds of more.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's something really interesting about that because I know in their making, you know, they're quite systematic in a way.
Right.
And I know you have a background in textiles, and that was something that actually this will lead nicely into the next work that I wanted to share. But I think it's really interesting because there is a very disorienting experience when you're in these in terms of what you can see, and you know, the images on the screen don't fully capture that at all. The light is shifting so much, and it's like being a bit in like a strange cloud or something. And so there's this interesting relationship between the kind of structure and logic of its making, which I know is very planned, and in the way that textiles are gridded and very kind of structured and organized in this gridded format, which is why this next work, which I know is older, about 12 years old, I think these are 2008, really fascinated me when I saw it for two reasons. One, it's a photograph that's overlaid with a drawing on vellum. And so again, the way you're working with different material, and I think this is probably work people don't know as well. But I was also really drawn to this work because of its lack of structure, if you will, or they're kind of like free form drawing in this. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this work. It does have a sort of serial component to it. And so there is sort of an underlying system in its making. So I guess that is there. And also if you could maybe touch on the idea of time in this, as this was made as a sequential piece, and how ideas of temporality factor into all the work that we've seen so far.
Yeah, it's such a good word. I appreciate your using that as opposed to the word time, really, because temporal implies that it's in flux. The word time seems relatively more definitive, but the word temporal implies that it's still moving, whatever it is one's discussing. It's like a condition of time as opposed to time. Yeah, these are called Insomnia. I made quite a number of them, 20 or so. Yeah, there are photographs that I took of my bed each morning for a period of time. I realized at some point that the bed was like a drawing and also a landscape. So I kept a camera in my presence in the bedroom, and got up each morning and just would turn back and snap a photograph. And it's incredible how varied they are. I think we're only showing this one detail. But then it became sort of like the photograph alone wasn't enough for me. And so I wanted to obscure it, to knit it together, to blur it, to sort of push the recognizable image back from recognition, and have it be a condition that I suppose one could say was micro or macro, like the sort of sense of one's distance from these is a bit unclear, like are you looking at the surface of the moon, or, or an incredible detail of the skin on the back of your hand, which is something I did a long time ago. Back in the late 80s, I did work about that. Yeah, the drawing on the top is there. It's a wandering line, and really it was sort of like I would get started, and it's almost like at what point do you stop? So I was trying to get those lines to feel like they were in a way slipping in and out of the photograph, the same way in some ways that I do now, where the next line of color in the work is there in relationship to the prior color, and how do they interact and play a kind of hide and seek with each other. So I think that matrix, if you will, gets at this idea of the temporal. That's why those something clear drawings are so unusual in a way, because there's something so distinct.
Yeah.
And maybe I don't know if I'm going to make more of those, but I think my tendency is to want to generate imagery and sculptural conditions that are fluid and indeterminate, where you can't quite tell what the structure is. Yeah, I think the word indeterminate I would use to partner with this idea of the temporal.
Yeah. I'll show one more image of this. This is for the exhibition that I recently curated, that just closed recently in Newburgh at Thornwillow Institute for River Valley Arts Collective. So I had an opportunity to spend time with these works. And they're really, the surfaces, they're really beautiful. It's difficult to see, again, like all of Anne's work, difficult to see fully in the JPEGs here.
I just want to do a quick shout out to River Valley Arts Collective for going forward with an in-person, like in real life exhibition. And this time they produced a beautiful online catalog and made the space available by appointment. Yeah, it was really incredible gift to be able to go to a real physical place and look at art.
Yeah, it was, and it encouraged us also. There's a short text that I wrote on these pieces in that catalog, as well as some essays by curators that are friends of the organization that contributed. So you can read a little bit more about these and see images in the publication. So I think I will close out of this screen sharing and ask you a few more questions that are more general.
Yeah, great.
Okay, here we go. So in thinking of sort of this idea of the indeterminate, or you know, different kind of ideas of temporality, I wanted to ask you about, since you've, you know, since the shutdown and that you've been home, and you mentioned something about your sense of time change, and that it had more to do with more physical experiences of the landscape rather than, you know, the hours of the day, and I wonder if you can expand on that a little bit, because I thought it was so interesting that you were sort of in tune in a different way with the days and the weeks and the months that was new.
Coping mechanism.
Yeah.
It's like, rather than, you know, when I read the daily news briefs from our governor, there's always these statistics about how many people have the virus and how many days we've been doing this, how many days we've been shutting down. I think those statistics are certainly helpful. They give us a picture, but I think I found myself, as I say, a coping mechanism to say, okay, I'm not so interested in how many days I've not been able to get on a train or go visit friends, that rather to, I suppose, try to embrace the idea that the world is a little smaller for each of us in a certain way. And those rhythms are phenomenal with weather. And, you know, it's interesting to me that the lockdown happened around the equinox, so that we could all sort of experience that light changes and so on. So I think it's been maybe a time to look a little, have your circle of influence be a little smaller and realize how much there is there to pay attention to. And I'm not romantic about it. I think it's about real life. And I think for many people, distance is made in other ways, like we're doing now. You know, space is expanded in other ways. But I think that's why there was sort of an urgency to making this work. Like, I just need to move my body and look at and use color, intense color, and make quite a bit of work quickly, sort of like to be in my body as opposed to in my intellect. Yeah.
I found, going back to this idea of walking, that I have a different sense of space because when I've been in the city and, and also just to pass time because I'm not going anywhere, I've been walking so much. And when I have started to go into the city, and it's so strange because everywhere I go, I walk, and I enjoy walking anyway, but it's like, it takes on a different, it's not one of those different forms that is addressed in the books we read, meditation or protest or these forms. It was really, a necessity and a mode of transport. And it really sort of changed my experience of the space and in the midst of everything going on. It was interesting. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up. And I know that you grew up in Iowa City, in a university town in the Midwest. And I'm interested in a couple things. One, you mentioned being present in 1968 and sort of experiencing protests really early on, and that making a strong impression. And also interested in that community and how that was influenced your work.
Yeah, I consider myself really lucky to have grown up in Iowa City. It's a phenomenal, relatively small town with a large research university in it. A really phenomenal medical school. And for many of you probably know, it's the home of the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop, which has long been a really, really important and critical place for creative writing. They have MFAs in translation, poetry, on and on. Yeah, so I was born in 1962, a year after my parents moved to Iowa City. My father was a young professor in the Department of Geography. My mother was a painter. And they moved into the house that I grew up in shortly after I was born. And they passed away recently, and that was the same house they lived in. I mean, they lived in that house for 50 some years. But yeah, it's an incredible community. High percentage of PhDs. It's the only constantly voting Democratic voting county in the state of Iowa. Iowa is one of the most literate states in the nation. I have many, many feelings of pride about where I grew up. But yeah, so I was born in 62. So in 68, the sort of something clear of 68 became the flash of 68, of 62 became the flash of 68. I think I was 6 years old, and my parents were young, thoughtful people, and my brother and I marched with them, we walked with them, we protested with them the Vietnam War. So I was a little 6-year-old with a candle singing Simon and Garfunkel songs in downtown Iowa City, and businesses were stoned and glass broken, and a lot of really important activity happened. And I was thinking this morning about the cycle of the kind of 50, 60 year cycle of history that, we're 50, 60 years from that time now. And if you think about 50, 60 years prior to that, the world, the Spanish flu, World War I, and so on. So these kind of cycles and secondary cycles that happen in history, at that time it was protesting the war, it was the feminist movement was active, and obviously civil rights, that kind of triangle. Now, in my view, we have climate change as the arcing biggest thing, of which the virus is a part of, I feel, and human health issues, and then obviously injustices on every level that we need to confront. So yeah, it was an incredible place to learn. And I've talked to friends of mine who have young children who are taking them to protest, and I say, you are giving them such a gift. They won't forget this. So yeah, but back to maybe some things you were hinting at about the writers community. Yeah, it just infuses that town in a major way. They're, I wrote down some names from the workshop, you know, Raymond Carver, Robert Bly, Wallace Stegner, John Irving, Ann Patchett, Marilyn Robinson, you know, Pulitzer Prize winning Marilyn Robinson, Jory Graham, incredible poet. Some of these people, not all of them obviously, because they weren't living when I was there, but many of them were neighbors and friends of my parents. And so yeah, very influential in understanding the role of the literary life in the creative life, or the political life. Yeah.
And it's something you've incorporated into the work quite a bit. I know poetry specifically.
Yeah, it's come and gone. I'm currently collaborating often with a poet who's a graduate of the workshop, Ginny Threefoot. I don't think she's on the call today. Yeah, I worked alongside her, making projects that present her work with my work, but also the titling of work, particularly since we've moved. I've searched for ways to suggest the things that influence the work, and so the titles are fragments of poems that in their fragmentation seem to hold something juicy and meaningful. So, yeah.
On that note, I know you included an Emily Dickinson poem in the presentation on Carrie's website, which is really great. I encourage everyone to check out. In addition to the images of the show, there's some images of Anne's studio and some other things to look at, including a poem by Emily Dickinson. So I wanted to ask you to read that to everyone, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. But one thing I thought I would share with you, a friend, Ajay Kurian, was doing interviews with artists on Instagram TV during coronavirus, and it was really wonderful. He always shared a quote or an excerpt from something he had read with the artist that made him think of their work. So I thought I might borrow that from him and share something with you. I was rereading it before the Zoom call, and it's a bit grim. So I questioned it whether I should share it, but you know, in a way it's also beautiful, and it's an author I really, really love. It's not someone we've spoken of, so I'll be curious if you know his work. But I'll go ahead and share this. It's an excerpt from a story called Downhill on a Forest Road. It was written in 2014 by Laszlo Krasznahorhai, and it was published in the New York Times. So you can find it in the New York Times. He published a series of short stories that are wonderful, and I think it was in the Opinionator section. It was a special series. And so what I'm not including here is the beginning of the story, which is, you know, it's a very mundane. It's a man getting in his car and going for a drive. But this is the last paragraph of that. So there's a bit of a reference to him driving in the middle. So just to give you the heads up. The onset of catastrophe is not signaled by the sense of everything falling through the dark and ending in accidental death. Everything, including a catastrophe, has a moment-by-moment structure, a structure that is beyond measurement or comprehension, that is maddeningly complex, or must be conceived in quite another manner, one in which the degree of complexity can be articulated only in terms of images that seem impossible to conjure, since time has slowed down to the point that the world has become indifferent to circumstances and various terrible preconditions that have arrived at a perfect universal conclusion. That because they are composed of intentions, because the moment is the result of unconscious choices, because a key doesn't immediately fit into the ignition, because we do not start in third gear and then move down to second, but because we start in second and we moved into third as we move down the hill, then turn onto the highway above the village, because the distance before us is like looking down a tunnel, because the greenery on the boughs still smell of morning dew, because the death of a dog and someone's badly executed maneuver when turning left, that is to say, because of one missed choice or another, of more missed choices and still more missed choices ad infinitum. All those maddening had we known choices, impossible to conceptualize, because the situation we find ourselves in is complicated, determined by something that is in the nature of neither God nor the devil, whose ways are impenetrable to us, and doomed to remain so, because choice is not simply a matter of choosing, but the result of that which may have happened anyway. So I'm going to send you a link to the full story.
Thank you. Wow.
We can discuss later. Yeah, and I'd love to invite you to, in turn, read the Emily Dickinson poem.
Yeah, so I selected a Dickinson poem for the online viewing room because I read a new biography of hers called something like In These Fevered Days. Seemed like the right thing to read, given that she made her nearly 2,000 incredible poems all from her bedroom. Seemed like the sort of shelter-in-place thing to do. So quickly, I'll read this. It's called After Great Pain, a Formal Feeling Comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore? And yesterday or centuries before. The feet, mechanical, go round, a wooden way, or ground, or air, or aught, regardless, groan. A quartz contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First chill, then stupor, then the letting go.
Beautiful.
Anne. Thank you. It's beautiful. Carrie's joined us, and I think is going to start off our Q&A. So I'm happy to have her back, part of the conversation.
So as always, I take myself off because I tend to interrupt when I find something interesting. I was thing after thing after thing after thing after thing. I was just wanting to raise my hand. So now I've taken some notes.
Great.
And I encourage everybody else who's watching and has some questions to chime in on the Q&A while I'm asking my questions, because rarely do we all get this opportunity to have this kind of forum. So, I mean, I got so much out of this, and this is why. And to go back to the beginning, this is why I've been doing this for 28 years. Is hearing these mindsets, and also how you manage the current day or inspired by the past. It's so fascinating to me, and this time is special that way. And when you talked about the 50-year cycles, I was born in 1968 in Chicago, and I've been asking my mother, what was it like then? Was it like then versus now? And it's been really fascinating, and almost, to then think about 50 years before that. That was just a really good way of putting all this into context, and almost a little scary in a way. So hopefully, we doesn't have the next 50 years we'll have a horrible flash or something like that. But some of the things I've also loved hearing what people say when they look at your work. It's kind of equal parts intense and meditative. I mean, it's very hard to get something that's that tight, but also is kind of like a breath or movement. And I've actually had, when I've had exhibitions of yours, I've had optometrists come with their own students to try and figure out how you play with the eye in color, in line, in layering, in every different way. And every piece does have a very different feeling to it. You were talking about color and how it disassociates to other types of feelings, or temperatures or things along those lines. So here's a question. So when all the work typically has a horizontal view or a vertical approach. How does that just kind of come as it comes, or because you typically are drawing them in a horizontal fashion, correct?
Yeah, particularly when they're, and that comes from the fact that some people may not know, but I work with an architect's parallel bar, which is attached and tethered to the perimeter of the table and is sort of moved up and down. It keeps it parallel. You can make it not parallel, of course, but why would you do that? So yeah, I do draw them in a horizontal direction. And as I said, if they're large, they require a series of steps. So the work is a reflection of taking those steps. Yeah, I think usually I have an intention about whether the drawing will have horizontal or vertical lines, but sometimes it takes off in a direction that you can't expect because these things are not repeatable because of the sort of truly diaristic and moment-to-moment decisions. So sometimes the energy of the work needs to be rested or in a horizontal format, and sometimes, most often, I'm interested in the vertical position because of its relationship to our body, that it's charged. We are vertical on a horizontal plane generally, and so they have an energy to them. When lines are standing, they have a kind of electricity and energy. When they're in a horizontal, you inherently quickly go to the reference to landscape. But that doesn't mean one is better or the other. I just find myself interested more often in the charged kind of vertical. But I spend a lot of time in my studio like this. Or I use a camera to trick myself. I flip them around a lot to try to understand their dynamic, to try to figure out whether the position I had thought they would be in, the standing or resting position is appropriate. So,
you know, it's interesting you bring this up because I made art a million years ago and quickly learned that I could talk about it better than I could create it. But whenever I'm looking at art or even like a new outfit I might want to buy, I always turn my head to the right. For some reason. I've never known why I do that. It's like, I don't know if your eyes take something different if they on that side, I don't know. I was just reminded of, so this is a few years ago, and a wonderful, great collectors, friends, were considering a big piece of yours. And they typically would buy works that have some type of representation in it. They hadn't really gotten more purely abstracted work. And this, especially the husband, Bruce, if you're out there, you made me work for this one, but do you remember he wanted to know like what the work was about? Like he wanted a story about like, okay, what is this about? And really challenged you to say what you were thinking of when you looked at this. And then we finally kind of figured it out. It was the beautiful rolling landscapes around you in the Hudson Valley, and then the fence posts that could kind of, because there were these different lines that had different pacing. And even through that exploration, I was just like, I never thought about it that way. So you mentioned the infamous light in the Hudson Valley, and the lush color and the kind of meditative element of that. How much of that is really kind of feeding into this new life? Not new anymore. How has it been? 5 years now or longer?
Yeah, a little more than 5 years I've lived here. Yeah, I would say it's less predominant in my thinking. I've always been somebody who each work feeds the next work. And so, as I said about this new body of work, it really was a sort of instinctual sort of my response to the situation, my rage, my despair, my rapture, like all of the sense of urgency and so on influenced the decisions about the path of the line and the use of color and interplay and so on. I think the landscape is, it's awesome and it's powerful, but I think it has a less literal feed into the work than it did when I first moved here. I think I've settled in and let it be part of my day, but not part of what I'm seeking in the work.
Mm-hmm. So Candice, do you want to check and let a few other people questions in? I don't know if there are some.
Yeah, we actually don't have any open questions at the moment. There were a couple sort of technical things that we addressed, a link to the short story and such. But nothing open at the moment.
Candice, do you have other thoughts or ideas that have come up as we've put this all together?
I have a lot actually. I'm hesitant to dive back in because I think Anne and I could keep going for a long time. We do have, actually, someone just prompted us here. Oh, actually, this is interesting, from Linda Stillman. Hi, Linda. She has a question: which came first, the thread work or the pencil work? And that's actually touches on what would have been my first question, would be, Anne used the word knitting when you were talking about the drawings, which I thought was really interesting. So
yeah, the current version of the thread installations, I would say, came after the pencil drawings. But I did an installation at the Sheldon Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska, at the university there, before the graphite drawings began. It was clumsy and interesting and powerful and all of that, but it was a drop of many thousands of strands of thread. And I parked that idea in my history, let it sit to try to understand, like, okay, what could that be if I were to repeat that idea? And it was a residency at Art Oh My in 2009 that began the current version of the thread installations. The graphite drawings began a couple years before that. Mm-hmm. And all of these things really, these two bodies of work, or this work that I think of as all the same, is really a sort of recognition of, like, what can drawing be? The pencil drawings in some way are very classical. I mean, they're pencil on paper. It's like as ubiquitous as it gets on some level. But how can you push that to a place that's not where we've seen it before? To use the pressure of my hand to create shadow and so on, and color and all the things that have come since I began doing it. And then the thread installations I think of as drawings in space. They are textile, but the textileness of it is, it's like the tool to make the line, to draw the line in space, and create this sort of immaterial and ephemeral and hard to grasp situation. So to me, they're hand in hand. I guess to answer your question, Linda, the drawings came first and then the installations, although there is this history of this work I made some years before the drawings began. I also remember asking myself a really sort of, in some ways, mundane question once when I had a show in Texas. I lived in Kansas City, and it was quite a long time ago. I had a very small stipend. And I remember saying to myself, like, okay, I'm not going to spend this stipend on shipping. I'm going to spend it to make the work. And so I had to fit everything I made into our car. And so what resulted was marks and materials that were as small as possible, but that in their installation could occupy the space of the gallery, which is actually quite big. So without showing you the work, it's hard to describe, but that sort of challenge of, like, how minute and how delicate and how tender can the mark be, is really what led to the pencil and then the thread, which is sewing thread weight. It's not heavy thread. It's quite fine and quite delicate. Yeah.
I'm seeing a question in our chat area that I'd like to bring up because I find also very fascinating. This is from Danielle Tegeter, another one of the CSG artists. Hi, Danielle. And she writes, hi, everyone. What a great discussion. I love the walking and literature references. My question is, given the recent attention and discussion on women and spirituality, especially in abstraction, such as the popular Clint show at the Guggenheim, can you all comment on your connection to that, if at all?
Yeah, wow. Thank you for the question, Danielle. Such a good reminder of lots of ways to speak about the work. Yes, I mean, I think, wow. I mean, that show, I think I went to 4 or 5 times. I've known about that work some time, but to see it in person was just phenomenal. Yeah, I think it's a kind of reckoning, a kind of a new way that we can lens the emergence of abstraction in the last 100 and some years, to realize that this woman was making this work like decades before work of that kind was made by a greater population. And the spiritual connection is important to me. I wouldn't consider myself someone who has a spiritual practice. But I think I can say, standing on my 2 feet in my overalls, that I am someone who, I think it's sort of, I'll use the word knitted, it's like knitted into the way I understand the world. It's not a conscious thing. But yeah, Danielle, I think, your work, Hilma's work, so many, speak to the power of the abstract to touch us pretty deeply. So yeah.
I need to chime in because probably one of my favorite days I can actually think of looking at art was a day spent in I think it was November of 2018. I began the day meeting Danielle and Anne at Anne's museum exhibition at the Museum of Design in New York to see her stunning exhibition, which was both a thread drawing and then just a single color pencil drawing. And again, the kind of meditative, spiritual discussion that's also so cerebral was something beautiful. So the three of us took in that show. And then I was also going to be visiting Danielle's studio because we were planning her show. And then we went up to see this absolutely mind-blowing, as you said, exhibition of Hilma af Klint. And for those who not long in the art world, this was an abstract artist woman that was back, it was about the turn of the century, was that the right time? That was never noted, and in some cases, was one of the forebearers of abstraction. And also she had a very kind of a cosmic element to it as well. And it was just, well, it was the most visited exhibition of the Guggenheim in its entire history. And it also kind of was, I think it's such an inspiration for artists because she wasn't doing this for, the fame or trying to get her toe in the water. I mean, she was just doing this because she had to. This is how she saw things. This is how she communicated, which I think is about the most purest way an artist can approach things in the studio. So, I mean, then Danielle and I went up and saw one of our artists, Liliana Porter, who at the young age of 78 was opening another exhibition at the Museo del Barrio. And so, it's so funny, in the day of the woman and day of everything else, I typically think if you put a word before the word artist, then anything other than an abstract artist, a minimalist artist, a figurative artist. If you put woman in front of artists, I think that lessens the thing. I'm so not about identity. I mean, I am a woman art dealer that's had a gallery for almost 30 years. And I'm not taking credit because I'm a woman. It's because we all have a good eye. There's not a single person that I show for their gender, their identity, their anything on those lines. And they're just some of the best artists making things out there. So I will tend to make that argument. But yeah, that was such a special day, guys, and I will never forget that. That totally inspired me. I saw it inspire you all. It was glorious. So I think we were all meant to see that right around that time. So, Candice, what are your thoughts on that topic?
It's something that Anne and I didn't talk about as much, but one of the concepts around walking was meditation. And I didn't ask you about that, Anne, but I can imagine your process has an element of that. Would you say so, or is it more kind of disjointed? Or
I'm not sure. I'm sure I get into some sort of state, but I don't really think of it as meditation. It's maybe working for me is meditation. I mean, those of you who know me know that I love to stack wood and organize things and get stuff done. So I think the challenge and sort of it's sort of like entering into the energy of the drawing, which I think is a form of meditation. I don't want to discredit the notion, but it's not how I would describe what I'm doing. It's more that the work is calling me to make it, and when I get the rhythm going, it's like when the volley in the tennis game gets going and it feels good. It's like you just keep.
So it might be more of a psychological state than a spiritual one.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah.
I like the stacking wood analogy because they're both it's process of accumulation, I think, in the drawings and then the wood stacking. Maybe something similar in the process.
So I noticed that Jane Lackey, hi Jane, had a question about the titling of the work. I don't know if she's still on the call, but we touched on that a little while ago, but the new work all begins with the word flash, and then there's some relatively more descriptive conditional word that follows, like opposite or frequent or hot or time. So they all sort of embody this idea of this flash of color or this unannounced disruption or presence in the work, formally in the work.
And I have another question regarding titles. So you typically have, as you talked about a little bit earlier, little segments of poems that act as the title of, which comes first, the phrase or the drawing?
Kind of all together. I think probably I make the final selection after the work is finished because I need to understand what it is. But it usually comes from something I'm reading while I'm working on it. I take lots and lots of notes of fragments, and I try to keep the provenience of that, for the accreditation of that piece of text. I think you've said you don't know who the writers are, but actually there is an attached reference with the publisher and the date, and that would be only right to reference the writer. So I think it comes after, but the possibilities are collected as the work is being made.
I don't think we addressed the title of the show, actually.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Vivid Messengers. Flash, Vivid Messengers. I feel that the COVID-19 coronavirus is a messenger for us. I think I've said it's like the messenger at the door knocking, saying like, wake up people, we've got some things to do. Because it's a messenger of many things, of climate change, of health, of international, the way in which we're so international. It certainly is a messenger of injustices, given its predominant effect on Black and Brown communities and those with less means, those who are essential workers who need to work. So I think it's a messenger. I think it's like, I'm grateful we have it in some way, some weird, twisted way. I think we can be grateful because it's telling us what we need to do. So yeah, it's a messenger.
I think that's about the most beautiful way of putting a pause in this conversation. I absolutely agree. This time is a reset button for how we all are spending our time, and in many ways, in my world,